This is what you're going to need to get started. You're going to need the pattern, which I will link down below, your fashion fabric. The binding is optional. You'll need all-purpose thread to match your fashion fabric. And I have two bobbins here. I have one filled with the all-purpose thread, and the second is filled with the elastic thread. I like to pre-wind these by hand. You can find more information about best practices with elastic thread in the actual instruction guide. You'll need a bit of elastic, buttons to match your project, interfacing, and these are a couple of tools that are really handy to have. Pins, or some people prefer clips, a straight ruler, a fabric marker, and some scissors. I'm going to pop all of this on a screen. Feel free to screenshot it. Before we get to sewing, we do need to do a few markings. If you have not already, you will want to mark all of your notches. I create my notches actually into the fabric, so I don't need to mark them with a pen or with chalk. The next thing we're going to want to make sure we mark is all of our buttonholes, and this will be placed on the outside of your fabric, so the fabric that will be facing out to the world and not into your body. We'll want to mark that. We will also want to be sure that we're marking any of our dots that connect, in this case, the straps for strap placement. With the back piece, you're going to want to mark the top two lines, which are your stitching and your matching line. This is going to create a tunnel for your elastic at the top of this back panel. All of these lines are stitching lines that will be done on your machine with your elastic thread as your bobbin. To begin sewing, you're going to start with your center front bodice and your side front bodice. You're going to match them at the notches. This is the first two bodice pieces put together. And if you can look and see behind here, there's a little bit of rippling. So right along this area, you're going to want to do some clips. And that will release the tension. I am planning to finish this seam with an overlock stitch. However, these clips will help it lay flat as we're going around that curve. You can do multiple different seam finishes if you'd like. You could line the bodice. You could bind the seam allowance. You could do a French seam. There's lots of different options, and if you look in your guide, you will see some of the options available. I'm just going to take it over to my overlocker, and I'm going to overlock this. I just thought I was going to be finishing all of the seams with my serger, but after the first two seams, my serger stopped working, so I'm going to have to problem solve that. In the meantime, I'm actually going to be pinking all of the seams from now on. So when you see that inconsistency, that's simply because my serger stopped working. We're now going to take the side back bodice piece and connect it in the same way that we did the center front and the side front, matching the notches, right sides together. We'll begin by pinning them in place, and then we'll take them to the machine and we will sew them with a 5/8 seam allowance. Our bodice is beginning to take shape. Now we are going to move on to our waistband. You have two waistband pieces that you've cut out. You've got your side back waistband, and you have your front waistband. We are going to connect these, matching the notches at the side seams, right sides together. Our bodice pieces have been completed, and we've attached our backside waistband to our front waistband. We are now going to attach these at the bottom of the bodice seam. And we will do that by putting right sides together, making sure we are matching our side seams and our notches here at the back and at the front. We'll do this on both pieces. And then we'll take it to the machine and we'll sew it with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. These are our strap pieces. This pattern comes with two options for straps. You have a wider strap and a more narrow strap. For this dress, I'm going to do the more narrow strap. The wrong side on both of these has been interfaced. Now I'm going to be sewing them right sides together, matching our notches, and I'm going to sew them at a 5/8 inch all the way down the long end. Once sewn together, you're going to want to trim the seam allowance down to 1/4 inch. You're now going to want to turn them right side out. There are multiple ways you can do this. For me, I'm going to do the safety pin method, which means I'll just take a safety pin, stick it through my seam allowance, and pull it through. Once your straps have been turned right side out, and don't forget to press them. I prefer to press them so that most of the seam allowance is underneath. And then you're going to take one of your straps and one of your bodice pieces, and on the pattern there are placements for your straps. They should be little dots on your pattern of both your front side and your back side. So I'm just going to line those up, line up at the seam allowance. And if you've pressed your seam allowance towards the underside of your strap, this side is going to be facing you while you are placing it here on your fabric. Line up all of the strap with the seam allowance right at that placement spot. And I'm going to take this over to my machine and I'm going to stay stitch this and here. And I'm going to do that on the other front side as well. All right, so we have our straps stay stitched in place. We're now going to put this to the side and we're going to start working on the center back panel. This is our center back panel. And as you remember from the beginning of cutting out your fabric, you've marked all of these lines on it. There's two lines at the top, and I'm actually going to run a basting stitch along those top two lines with the all-purpose thread. We're not using the elastic thread yet. We're going to build that channel first. So I'm going to take it over to my machine and I'm going to do that first. So for this, you're going to want to have your machine set to your longest stitch length. We've ironed along that first stitching line, and now we're going to fold along that second stitching line. Okay, now we're going to take it along to the machine and we're going to stitch all along. So you're now back to a regular stitch length. At this point, we are going to start doing the shirring. And so we're going to need to switch out our bobbin for the elastic thread bobbin. And we are going to do a straight stitch across all of the lines that we have previously marked on this panel. We won't be backstitching at the beginning and at the end, but leave a long tail to tie off. Once again, you're going to want your machine at a longer stitch length. I find 3 and above works really well. The longer your stitch length, the more shearing effect you're going to get. The shorter, the less effect you'll have. So I think I'm going to do 4. So you're going to start with your fabric face up in the machine. And you're going to just follow along the lines you've previously marked. And this is the general effect. You're going to continue these stitches all the way down. Once you're done with shearing, your piece is going to look a little something like this, all scrunchy bunchy. I'm going to take this over to the iron and give it a very gentle light press and steam. So the next step is optional, and it's adding the elastic to the top tunnel. I have this dress here for you to see. If you do not want to add the elastic, it gives a bit of a ruffle look to the top of the back panel, which is pretty cute. For this particular dress, though, I am going to add the elastic. It does add a little bit more stability up at the top of the garment. However, it's incredibly comfortable like this as well. To add the elastic in, I'm once again going to use my trusty little safety pin, and I'm also going to need a straight pin. I've got a straight pin here, a safety pin, my elastic, and my piece that I'm going to insert it into. I'm going to put my safety pin, my elastic. I'm going to start feeding it in the tunnel. Once the elastic is pulled all the way through, it's going to look a little bit like this. I have it pinned in place so it doesn't slide out and around. I'm going to take it to the machine and I'm going to just do a quick little stay stitch here and here. And then we can start putting it into the rest of the bodice. Once you've completed securing the elastic at the top, it's a little hairy, but you're going to want to make sure that, of course, you get all of the elastics and threads out of the way before you start aligning your seams. You're going to align the bottom edges. So this is the waistband seam here, and then this is the bottom of the center back. When you align the edges, there'll be a little edge left over here at the top, and this is going to be used for the facing seam allowance. So that should indeed happen. Don't stretch it all the way up here. You won't have anything to attach your facing to. Both of these seams are going to be sewn at 5/8 inch away from the edge with a straight stitch with regular thread in your bobbin. Now that our bodice is mostly together, we can move on to our skirt. You're going to want 2 of your pieces. You're going to want to get your upper front skirt tier and then your back upper skirt tier. On the very top of each of these pieces, we are going to run 2 rows of basting stitches with the machine. So I'm just going to take it straight over to the machine and do those, and then I will see you when that's done. Once you have put your basting stitches in, you're going to want to pull your threads on both lines of stitching, if I can get a hold of them. It's just going to be a gentle pull. Don't have to put much force into it. You're going to inch it along until it matches the length of your front waistband. When it's all ready, it'll look a bit like this. You're then going to want to take your pocket pieces. We have cut 4 of these in the very beginning. You're going to want to take one of them, right sides together, along the side seam of both your front pieces. You're going to pin them in place, and then you're going to take it over to the machine, and you are actually not going to be doing a 5/8 inch seam allowance. You're going to do a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Both pockets on our front top tier have been applied to the, so what we're going to do is we're going to press the seam allowance towards the pocket, and then we are going to take it to the machine and we are going to top stitch along this side of the pocket, catching the seam allowance as we go. We have completed our front pocket attachment. As you can see, this is the top stitching. It's about 1/8 of an inch from the edge. This is going to help control the seam allowance. You're also going to repeat this on the back pieces. Now we have our bottom skirt tier pieces, and I know I went a little off script because in the instructions I've applied these skirt pieces before the pockets. However, you can do it either way. It doesn't actually detract from any of the ease if you do it now. But that is what we're going to do. We are going to face the top of them and then gather the same way that we did with the top tier. Okay, so I've got my upper back piece and I've got my lower back piece. I'm pulling the threads on my lower back piece. Once you have it a little bit gathered, you're going to want to put right sides together. And as you're pinning, you're going to want to even out your gathers so that you don't have a big clump of gathers and then no gathers. I like to go find end to end first. And then I find my notches. And I make sure that I have enough gathering on either side of my notch so that it doesn't look uneven. And you're going to do that for the whole length, and then you'll take it over to the machine and you'll do a 5/8 inch seam allowance straight stitch. We have our front skirts, top tier and bottom tier attached, and then we also have our back skirt, top tier and bottom tier attached. We are now going to attach the 2 skirts together at the pockets. So you're going to match right sides together. You're going to want to match your notches and your top of your pocket. You are also going to want to make sure that you have matched down at your seam allowance. Together. We are going to sew this at a 5/8 inch seam allowance, straight stitch. We are going to start here at the top and we are going to go all the way around. And we are going to sew through that 1/4 inch seam allowance at the pocket attach. And we'll stop right along that stitching. Pockets have been sewn together. On your pocket pattern piece, there are 2 dots that you will have marked here. This is your pocket opening. So I have actually taken them from the pocket side and transferred it over to the body side, so I know exactly where to stop. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start at the top edge and I'm going to sew down to this opening at a 5/8 inch from this seam allowance. And then I'm going to stop. I'll do my back stitch, stop, and then start again down here, and I will go all the way down to the hem. Before you do that, you just want to make sure that everything's aligned. So you want to line up your tops, make sure that you have a very strong alignment on your horizontal seam here, and then at your hem. Okay, sewing friends, we have all of our skirt pieces attached to one another. When you press your side seams, you'll press the bottom half open, and as you get to the pocket, you're actually going to press the pocket and the seam allowance towards the front. That will make sure that your pocket is staying towards the front, and you get a nice little crease where your pocket opening is, so it can nearly be invisible. We're now going to work towards putting our bodice and our skirt together. We're now going to attach the bodice to the skirt. We're going to start by matching at our center fronts. Have our pocket bag towards the front skirt. Just secure it in place so it doesn't wobble around as we're trying to meet all of our other lines here. I'm going to match our side seams. Now that we've matched our side seam and our center front, we're going to ease the skirt similar to how we matched the bottom of the skirt with the top tier of the skirt. Just making sure that all of our gathering is evenly distributed. We're then going to match the side seam on the other side, making sure our pocket bag is going towards the front. Match our center fronts. We ease the skirt. Once you've pinned both of your sides, you can start working towards your back. And you're going to do similar in process, making sure that your ruching is all generally even. You have match points here. So here is my notch on both my bodice piece and my skirt. Make sure those are matched up. You'll do it on the other side as well. The seam allowance for the back panel is going to go towards the side panel. Once you get to the actual back panel portion, it gets a little tricky because you're dealing with gathering and then ruching. So you're going to gently, very, very gently stretch the bottom seam, or not seam, I'm sorry, the bottom edge, and pin in place. I'm going to take this over to the machine and I'm going to sew 5/8 inch seam allowance all along the edge, and then the bodice and the skirt will be attached. We're getting to the end zone here. We are now going to start working on our facings. These are the last of our puzzle pieces. These are all of our internal facings. So we have our front facing, our side front facing, our back side facing, and our skirt facing. All of these have been interfaced on the wrong side. And they'll get sewn up right sides together with a 5/8 and seam allowance. They'll go generally in this pattern. This skirt facing will be here. I'm going to take these over to the machine, sew them up, and I'll show you what they look like when completed. These are our facings put together. I've trimmed the seam allowance back to reduce bulk. The next step we're going to do is finish the inner edge. This outer edge here is going to be attached to the garment, so we can finish this inner edge a couple different ways. If you were doing a lining, you could actually apply this to the lining and then you could attach the entire thing to the garment. I'm not lining this version. You can also just turn over the edge and top stitch to give it a clean finish, I am going to use a bias binding, and I'm going to apply that along this inner edge, all the way from the top edge down there and then all the way down. Bindings have been applied to our facings, so now we can start actually applying the facing to our dress. We are going to take one of the sides, right sides together. We are going to match the corners, and there are notches all the way down your facing that should align with the notches on your dress. We're also going to want to make sure that we are aligning this seam here with the waist seam at the dress. And this is the top of the waistband that we are aligning it to. Then we are going to go all along the top and align all along that front edge with the strap tucked inside so that it shows on the outside of our dress and not the inside. And then once we get to this back seam, hold on, let me pin this spot first and then I'll continue saying what I was saying. Once we get to this back seam, you have your seam allowance on the inside pressed towards the body, the side body of your fabric, and you're actually going to want to take just the little bit of extra that is left and fold it under so that they meet perfectly right along this edge. Pin that in place. I'm going to keep pinning all along here and then all along the skirt length. And then I'm going to sew it with a 5/8 inch seam allowance. And I'll show you how to clip the edges and the corners after I've finished that. Our next steps involved trimming some of our seam allowance. If you see, this is our seam allowance untrimmed at this corner, and you don't get a very nice crisp corner. So it's nice to trim that from the inside here. And then you'll get a much less bulky corner, basically. And then we are going to press the seam allowance towards the facing, and we are going to top stitch all along this edge and all along the top edge here. So let's first start by trimming our seam allowance. There are a bunch of different strategies people have for trimming seam allowance. I'm just going to do on this side a nice little diagonal cut, and then I'm going to grade the seam allowance out on either side of that corner. So it releases the bulk from the center and from the sides here. Now another way people like to do it is sometimes they'll actually just clip into it. Let me show you the difference of what these both look like. So this is the one we've graded. I'm gonna grab my point turner. This is an incredibly handy little tool for turning points. If you make shirts, this is great for collars, but it also works for any other point that you need to turn. It really just sort of gets into the crevices. And then this is the one that has just been clipped and not graded. And from the outside, you can see that if you grade your seams, you get a much cleaner edge, whereas there's a lot of bulk on this one and your corner isn't nearly as crisp. So I am going to grade out this side as well, and then I'll move on and press and do my top stitching. So this here is the understitch. I'm a big believer in an understitch. I think it helps elevate your garments. It controls the seam allowance so that you get a good crisp edge without your internal lining or facings popping out at you. So I really like to add this to my garments. As you can see, I've caught the seam allowance into the top stitch here, and on the corner, Oh, we're gonna wait for it to focus. There we go. On the corner, you can see I got as close as I could to the actual corner, but because of the angle of the garment, etc., it can be really challenging to get all the way in there. However, I find that this, as long as we get as close as we can, it still keeps controlling that seam allowance to the inside. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go off script just a little bit, and I'm going to hem my dress. I know this is the length that I want it, and I'm going to do this a little different than the instruction booklet, and I'm going to take the internal facing and flip it right side together and pin it in place. And then I'm going to sew across this internal facing about 1/2 inch, because I'm going to do the entirety of the hem at 1/2 inch. So whatever your entire hem is going to be, if you're hemming it 1 inch, but you're rolling it twice, making it 1/2 inch, then you're going to want to do it at 1 inch, etc., etc. So I'm going to do that. And this is just to show you a slightly different way of hemming your garment from what the booklet called out. Now that we've actually stitched down the facing to the garment, we are going to want to clip this corner just like we did at the top of it, so we get a nice crisp edge there on the bottom. And we are going to roll it out. Grab my point turner again. Get a good crisp edge. So now for the rest of the hem, we are just going to roll it. I'm going to do a double roll because I'm going to do it at 1/4 inch from the edge, but a 1/4 inch rolled over and then a 1/4 inch rolled over again. And we're just going to pin it in place all along the bottom edge. I just pinned a handful of things. I pinned the entire hem, which you can do this by machine. You can totally just top stitch this, bit bam boom, hem is done. I think I'm going to do it by hand though. I like the look of a blind stitch, and while I can do a blind stitch in my machine, I don't mind the process of hand sewing, so I'm actually going to do mine by hand. There are a couple other places I pinned. I pinned the facing down at all of the seam allowances, and I'm going to tack by hand, but again, you could tack by machine. I'm going to tack at all of the seam allowance points. So we've got our skirt join, we've got our skirt to waist join, we got our waist to bodice join, and then we actually have the bodice seams, and I will tack the facing all along there. And then at the center back, I'm going to do a quick little blind stitch running down this edge. And again, you can definitely do this by machine by flipping it out and then grabbing the seam allowance in the other seam allowance and just sandwiching this or sewing those two together. But I'm going to do it all by hand. I just like the process of hand sewing, so I don't mind doing it. After we do that, we're going to get everything a good press, and then we will be ready for the button and buttonholes. I forgot to mention one more spot. I'm actually going to tack my seam allowance from my pocket bags down to the joint, the skirt join seam allowance as well, and that'll just help control my pocket bags so they are less likely to bunch while I'm wearing the dress. We're down to our final step, buttonholes and buttons. I am going to have machine buttonholes. I'm fine with that. I have already marked the placements for my buttons and my buttonholes on my fabric. This came off of the pattern. I am going to use this button gauge just to make sure that I marked them appropriately when I was first marking my pattern, to make sure that they are indeed the correct distance apart and evenly spaced. And they look great. So now that I've established that they look good, I am actually just going to take them over to the machine, and I am going to have the machine process the buttonholes.